Hello again, YouTube. It's Skylar. Welcome back to my face. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about trans people in sports. A topic that I have put off for a very long time and undoubtedly will cause no contention. Alright, before we get into it, please remember to hit the like and subscribe button. It actually really does help my channel and get my message out to more people. So if you could do that, that would be fantastic. Alright, so I've deliberated and thought about this topic for a very long time. And the conclusion that I've reached is I don't know why people care. Not about trans people in sports, but just why people care about sports in general. Of all the things in our society that we have to worry about, honestly, from my opinion, sports really isn't that big of a deal. It's people running around and scoring points, and it's all for entertainment. It's really, I'm not entirely sure what the fascination is. I'm also not sure how trans rights and sports became the keystone for the trans rights debate. Of all the things that affect people, trans people in sports is probably the most minuscule effect of anything that trans people have an effect on anyone in society. So it really strikes me as just bizarre that people would throw so much weight and attention behind this topic. But because I'm trans and I have a trans YouTube channel, I knew eventually that I would need to talk about this topic. So, here are my thoughts. Do I think that trans people should be in sports that align with their gender identity? Yes, I think that is 100% a civil liberties issue. I believe that we shouldn't discriminate based on gender identity in sports, in much the same way that we already don't do that in things like the workplace or employment or, government programs or anything to that sort. Those rules, for the most part, are, enshrined, and most companies do that on their own volition. They don't wait for the government. They actually just say, we're not going to discriminate against trans people because we know that's the right thing to do. But when it comes to trans people in sports, there seems to be this really weird narrative that somehow being trans gives you some sort of advantage. Now, being a trans person, having transitioned over a decade ago, I can tell you that outside of reducing gender dysphoria and feeling happy as my authentic self, being trans has netted me zero benefit in any situation. Like I said, the only thing that being trans helps with is reducing the gender dysphoria and allowing the person to just live as their authentic self. But this notion, this idea that somehow, despite all of the negative social consequences and connotations and all of the societal stigma and propaganda about trans people, the idea that somebody would transition just to have a slight advantage in a single area of life that is normally highly competitive and contested anyway is remarkably bizarre to me. Because no person, sane or otherwise, would upend their entire life, go through the process of physical transition from one gender to the other, and risk ostracization and stigmatization by both their friends, families, and communities, and go through all of that discrimination just so that they could have a small perceived advantage in a single category of a very niche area of sports. Now, I don't usually use the term Occam's razor because I feel like it's overused. But I think in this scenario, I think most people can see how ludicrous that sounds. Now, being trans, for me, is wonderful and amazing, and I love being trans, and trans positivity is something I feel we should have more of in society, and trans people should be celebrated for who they are, and that celebrate diversity in general, overall, of everybody's gender identity and diversity across the board everywhere. But I think it goes without saying, which is why I didn't want to make this video for the longest time, that we need to have a conversation about this. If you really wanted to talk about this in a serious manner beyond that, you're talking about something that's so nuanced that you're literally talking about specific examples of individual people. The process of physical transition is exactly what it sounds like. It's physical transition. I have the same hormone levels and fat redistribution as any cisgender woman does. I personally, if I was to go compete in sports, I know I wouldn't win. I mean, the most exercise that I've gotten in the past couple months is just going for a walk. And this is really the crux of what I want to talk about, is what is it that people are really upset about here? Are they upset because of some perceived advantage / disadvantage of one small group of people? That I truly believe that the reason that trans people in sports is so contested, especially on the right, is that people who are transphobic genuinely have a belief that trans people don't have a right to exist. And by excluding them from one of what's considered the most tribalistic aspect of society, people get very caught up in sports regardless of whether it's trans or not. I don't see the appeal myself. I'm all for exercise and everything, but some people go so deep into sports that, it's just like, whoa. I'm sure they have their reason, and I have my hobbies too. But to talk about this issue really comes down to the core, I think, of transphobia, which is by allowing trans people to compete in sports, there is this preconceived conception that they seem to be thinking that, well, I'm condoning trans people existing, or trans people are allowed to exist in society. And so the knee-jerk reaction to that is, we'll just ban them from sports. I've even heard some arguments of creating a third gender sport, which I'm not even going to go into because that just sounds silly to me. But it's this concept of the foot in the door argument, where if we can use sports as leverage to ban trans people, we now have an argument to base off of how we can ban trans people from other aspects of society. Once you start going down that rabbit hole of this group of people is not allowed in this area, this group of people is not allowed in that area, then you start to open the door for discrimination to happen at all levels for all people. We shouldn't get caught up in this debate, and honestly, I still think it's odd that people are still even contesting this in the first place. But yeah, because that's another thing, is that for some strange reason, the conversation always revolves around transgender women. It never, ever, ever is brought up that trans men exist, female to male. You do realize that if making trans people compete in the gender that they used to be, you would have trans men who are on testosterone with muscular fatigues and playing in women's sports. But somehow the argument is we want to keep men out of women's sports. So I'm just trying to find the logic in what they're trying to advocate for. And at the end of the day, all I can see is it just comes down to basic transphobia. We don't like trans people. What can we do to, push them down? And that's all it is. That's all this topic is basically about. And I'm not going to entertain that. Trans people are people. Trans rights are human rights. Being trans is not something that you do. It's something that you are. And being trans is something that is inherent to the human condition. So we shouldn't discriminate against people for something they have no control over. And again, the physiological differences, you're going into the nuance of, is this amount of hormone level higher, or is this type of fat redistribution on the body? Like, it's so nuanced. How do you, what about cisgender women who have high levels of testosterone? Most trans women have low levels of testosterone. So, and then, trans men in women's sports, because that's the logical conclusion of this argument, if they're not just outright saying we just want to ban all trans people from sports, period. There is no argument. It just makes sense to just have people compete with their gender identity. It is conducive to a society based on compassion and understanding for those around them to include people from different walks of life, and trans people are some of those people. So again, I probably am not going to bring up this topic again because it's just really weird to talk about because of the things that I just explained. I would much rather focus my attention on talking about, access to healthcare, or, civil liberties in employment, or things of that nature. Sports just doesn't. Yes, that is my position, is that trans people should compete in sports. But I just wish we could move away from that topic because it just seems so irrelevant to the rest of the conversation. And I think it's just an emotional reaction from people who are, quite frankly, just misinformed and miseducated about trans people and trans topics. So, with that said, if you enjoy my content, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing videos. And I also have a Patreon down in the description below. Again, it's just for people who would want to contribute to me. I do plan on making a exclusive members only content here shortly. So any help from that would be really helpful. But again, no pressure. It's just there for those who would like to support me that way. Also, anybody that didn't get a chance to see my recent post, I am in the process of editing my book. So the book has been written, and now I'm just editing it, and then it'll be published shortly thereafter. So I'm really excited. I'm going to be drinking a lot of coffee because I'd like to get this done as soon as possible. And with that said, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and take care. Bye.